these people where my mind is always whirling and I'm always trying to plan ahead and figure out what's on the to-do list. And I'm not really one to have kind of a calm mind until the summer of 2005. Now, in the summer of 2005, I had decided to go on a summer holiday backpacking through a remote part of Afghanistan in the beautiful mountains. Well, needless to say, I didn't make it very far and got stuck in Tajikistan and was wandering around about my second day. I was back at my guest house taking a rest, and somebody knocks on my door, very surprised because I don't know anybody in Tajikistan. And there was somebody from the village, and with a 24-year-old university student from England, Daniel. And it turned out there was a second tourist wandering around Tajikistan, and the locals thought that Daniel and I should travel together, which was fine with us. And so Daniel wanted to find the Yaknobes. Now, the Yaknobes had for millennia lived along the central part of the Silk Road. And then in 600-700 AD, as Muslims came in from Arabia to convert the Central Asians to Islam, they ran up into the mountains and disappeared for 1,000 years. No contact with the outside world. Well, I kind of thought this would be interesting. I had no idea if we had any chance of finding the Yaknobes, but I was game, so Daniel and I set off. And one day we had hired a car to drive us into the base of one mountain where we had a guess and of the Yaknobes might be on this mountain. And so we went to the village head, and we were quite surprised, I think, when the village head said that not only did he know of the Yaknobes, they certainly were in the mountain above, but his son-in-law would go up and help them during harvest time to make extra money. And his son-in-law could lead us up. Now, I still wasn't convinced that we really could find them, but the next morning, Khurshid, his donkey, Daniel, and I set out. And we start climbing and don't see a soul, no buildings. Keep going. It finally gets dark, we're going. I'm now to the point where I don't care who we meet. I would just like any village. And so about 8 o'clock at night, we finally come upon a village. Khurshid leads us into the biggest building in the village, and we stick our heads in, and there's about 30 men sitting against a wall on pallets in the room, and they aren't surprised to see us. They just kind of calmly, they're happy that we're there, and they sort of wave us to come in, and they scoot to make room for the three of us to sit down, and they bring each of us a bowl of soup for dinner. Daniel and I are kind of looking at each other like, are these them? And Daniel, he had been studying in Iran for the year, learning Farsi, and all Central Asian languages are based in Farsi. So I said, nudging Daniel, I'm like, well, ask them if they're the Yaknobes. And he does, turns to the guy next to him, and the guy is like, yes, we're the Yaknobes. And, they just are fine that we're there, and Daniel and I are looking at each other because we think this is, huge. We found them. And the Yaknobes seem to think this is, no big deal. And so as this kind of continues, I find, Daniel, ask them, do they get a lot of foreigners? And so he turns to the guy, and the guy's like, oh yeah, we got the Swiss guys in '88, and the English guys who came before the war, and the Tajik war ended in '97, so we're the third foreigners they had seen in 20 years. But I guess if you, don't ever see foreigners at a normal time, this probably did seem like a regular, occurrence. Decade gone by. So the next morning, Daniel and I are having breakfast with the villagers, and Daniel really wants to find the village where the Yaknob chief lives. So we're in a valley, and there's just a series of Yaknob villages. And so he turns to the men, and he asks them, we're in this village, which village does the chief live in? And, how far away is it and how long would it take for us to walk there, which seemed pretty straightforward, but I knew it wasn't going well because the men in the village were all huddled together and having this very long conversation, and then they would like turn to Daniel and they would shake their head and shrug their shoulders, and Daniel was trying again even harder, and the men would huddle together and finally shake their head and shrug their shoulders. And Daniel finally turns to me and he's very angry. And he's like, they refuse to help us. They will not tell us where the chief is, and they will not tell us how to get there. So Daniel, these people seem very gracious. I just think they're not really understanding your question. I think tomorrow morning, let's just head out with Khurshid and the donkey and just walk to the next village. Fine. Well, the next morning before we set out, it turned out, sure enough, I was right, because one of the men came up to us and he said, well, you have to come back because we have a big celebration. One of our families has recently had a boy, and he's been circumcised, and for the Yaknos, this is a really big deal. So we're going to have this big celebration, and we'd like you to come. Now, Daniel and I are all excited. I mean, how great. We get to see what the Yaknos consider a major life event and how they celebrate that. So we, of course, asked the most logical question we could think of, when do you want us back? Well, thus ensued the next heads together, long conversation, to the point where we finally realized they didn't understand what day of the week it was, and they didn't understand what day they wanted us to come back. And so finally, Daniel and I, we just assured them that we would come back, and we decided to just head off, and we figured somehow this would all work out. And this is about the time my brain just started to click off, because there was no way we could plan anything with the Yaknos. You'd ask what somebody did, and nobody had ever asked them that question before because they all knew each other from birth to death. And there's just the basic things. The only thing you could do was just be with them, be with the mountains in the moment. And just in case you're wondering, Daniel and I did make it back to the celebration on time, but not the way you would think. One day, we're probably about a week later, who knows how many days went by, and we see one of the teenagers from the first village, a boy, come through. And he was going from village to village and announcing the celebration would start tomorrow. And everybody had to stop the harvest and head down to the village. And that is how Daniel and I made it to the celebration with no planning. Thank you.